We've all taken the political compass test at some point, and we've probably all criticized it at some point too. But there's no denying that it's a fun and illustrative little tool. So today I decided why not try to see where every US president ranks on the political compass. I considered completing an individual test for each president, trying to answer the questions as though I were them, but not only would this probably be a ludicrously long process, but there's no doubt several of the questions would not translate well from contemporary politics to historic politics, and would also fail to do justice to the wide breadth and nuance of American political ideology across time. So instead I will be giving a summary of each president's ideology and position and try to pinpoint where they might be on this chart. Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Of course, we're beginning with George Washington. Washington was ideologically aligned with many of the beliefs of the Federalist Party, which was highly centralist and elitist. However, this was tempered by his hesitance to assume and use power, with this restraint demonstrating a more libertarian character than most other Federalists. This being said, he came to power at a time when America needed steadfast leadership and authority, and he was not above utilizing that power when necessary. I think Washington would fit squarely near the middle of the authorite quadrant. Adams was a more dedicated Federalist than Washington, but still demonstrated relative restraint in an attempt to emulate Washington's more pragmatic approach to leadership. Adams would most likely lay just northeast of Washington. Jefferson stood at the polar opposite position of federalism, strongly supporting decentralization, states' rights, agrarianism, and all that came with that. Jefferson was probably one of the most pro-small government presidents in American history, so we can expect him to be fairly down south. While far from an elitist, at least ideologically, given the era in which he lived, Jefferson's egalitarian views probably wouldn't have landed him in the lib-left quadrant, but somewhat close to the compass line. Much like Adams to Washington, James Madison would fall somewhere to the northeast of his predecessor, being both less egalitarian and more of an elitist than Jefferson, as well as being more of a centralist, having supported the adoption of the Constitution despite Jefferson's skepticism of the document. Madison was also more of a war hawk and would become even more of a centralist after the War of 1812 highlighted the vulnerabilities of a lax federal government in wartime. James Monroe, who was essentially Jefferson's apprentice, would likely cluster between Jefferson and Madison, sharing in the Democratic-Republican ideology while balancing the visions of both his elders. Where Monroe broke most with Jefferson and Madison was probably that he was far more pro-British than his pro-French counterparts. John Quincy Adams was essentially a very lukewarm Federalist in all but name, having been a member of the Democratic-Republican Party, but having also been influenced by the Federalist ideology much like his father, though this being said, his ideology was also tempered by the dominant Jeffersonian ideology of the time, making him more egalitarian and less willing to utilize extensive government powers as his father might have. Further, being a northerner, Adams' egalitarianism extended to a firm position against slavery. This would place Adams southwest of Washington and northwest of Madison. Andrew Jackson came from a highly populist ideological strain of Jeffersonian thought, one which favored decentralization but simultaneously allowed an executive to assume wide-reaching powers when necessary at the expense of Congress, essentially seeking a very powerful executive who acted rarely. Jefferson was also far less elitist than many of his counterparts, having come from a poor background himself and expanding the vote to a wider grouping of the population. Because of all these factors, it's somewhat difficult to place him. However, he would almost certainly fall within or just slightly north of the libertarian right quadrant, perhaps slightly over, and lay just east of the Jeffersonians. Van Buren would likely fall noticeably to the south and west of Jackson, given his more egalitarian values and less authoritarian views. Harrison was famous for two things which make placing him a bit difficult. One, he only served as president for about a month, and two, he was known to have, quote, no strong opinions. While he ran as a Whig, Harrison's personal ideology would have probably placed him just east of Madison, having demonstrated some pro-slavery sympathies in the past, but also having emphasized his belief in democratic republicanism and the weakening of the executive branch in favor of Congress. Harrison's successor, John Tyler, would likely lay directly to the southeast of Andrew Jackson, having largely supported his decentralization and democratization policies, but strongly opposed his belief in a strong executive, with Tyler being far more sympathetic to the concept of states' rights. James K. Polk would rank just south of Jackson, having been a strong believer in Jacksonian ideology, though exercising greater restraint in what he felt were the limits of the executive, most notably in what Jackson had advocated for but not practiced, only serving one single term, but utilizing that time in office to tackle the foremost issues of the country with extensive executive power, while allowing the states to largely govern themselves at the local level. Zachary Taylor is another interesting Whig with somewhat obscure political leanings, having been largely indifferent to politics for most of his life. He had expressed somewhat egalitarian views, both respecting the religious autonomy of the Mormons and opposing the expansion of slavery into the West, though Taylor was also something of an authoritarian, no doubt coming from his military background, disregarding Congress despite congressional supremacy being one of the chief tenets of Whig ideology. Taylor would probably rank as far north as Jackson in authoritarianism and lay about as far right as Madison. Millard Fillmore would probably rank just slightly north of and between Madison and Harrison, having begun utilizing additional federal powers under congressional authority as per the Whig agenda, but not to their fullest extent. Pierce, despite being a Northerner, was a strong Southern sympathizer and believer in states' rights doctrine, placing him just south of Tyler. Buchanan likely lies between the triangle of Jackson, Polk, and Tyler, holding Southern sympathies and believing in states' rights doctrine, but not being above utilizing executive authority when he felt necessary, such as in the case of the Utah War. Of course, despite ranking closely along these three ideologically, Buchanan was far less effective than any of them. Abraham Lincoln from an ideological standpoint is probably the truest expression we saw of Whig ideology in the presidential office, though of course he had to assume significant executive powers on account of the Civil War. Lincoln's egalitarian views but belief in the use of government power would likely rank him well to the northwest of both Jackson and Taylor, and perhaps even surpassing Washington and Adams. Andrew Johnson had been a far cry from Lincoln's own ideology, and though he had attempted to honor Lincoln's post-war vision upon his ascension to the presidential office, Johnson's own ideology would see him placed slightly to the south of and between Polk and Buchanan. Ulysses Grant was a bit of a late bloomer in his political ideology, being somewhat indifferent to it like fellow military president Zachary Taylor. However, the events of the Civil War and the influence of the radical Republicans would contribute significantly to the shaping of Grant's ideology. Grant surpasses Lincoln in authoritarianism, having expanded the use of federal authority in domestic peacekeeping and forcing widespread censorship to curtail what he called immorality and disloyalty, pushing for the restricting of religious teaching and funding in schools, cracking down on the Mormons, Native Americans, Southerners, and so on. Fellow Republican Charles Sumner even described Grantism as the closest thing to despotic autocracy ever experienced by the United States. The influence of the radical Republicans and their egalitarian views pushed Grant over the edge as our first president in the authoritarian left quadrant. Hay's ideology was fairly meritocratic, and though he wasn't personally opposed to the use of government power to achieve national goals, he had significantly reduced the use of federal power seen under the Grant administration. Hayes would probably land somewhere between Jackson and Washington. James Garfield would be another meritocratic Republican or half-breed Republican and would oppose the Grant loyalists or stalwarts who depended heavily upon patronage and political machines. Garfield would likely stand just west of Hayes. Chester A. Arthur had been a stalwart himself, but seemed to have tempered his views over the years, bringing him in line with many of his predecessors' views. He would likely stand just slightly to the northwest of Garfield. Grover Cleveland was a bourbon Democrat embracing meritocratic, laissez-faire, and fiscally conservative policies, placing him in the liberal right quadrant, just southwest of Franklin Pierce. In the aftermath of Cleveland's presidency, Benjamin Harrison would restore protectionist tariffs and crack down on business trusts with the Sherman Antitrust Act, placing him somewhere between and to the west of Garfield and Arthur. McKinley, with his strong position on protectionism and nationalism, would probably also cluster in this general area to the north and east of Arthur, which interestingly enough places him just slightly left of Washington, which, upon reflecting on their politics, does make a good degree of sense. Theodore Roosevelt would advance further into the north, making extended use of government power in the new progressive era and looming over into the authoritarian left category given his increasingly anti-business and pro-labor views. Taft would stand to Theodore's southeast, being more fiscally conservative and exercising more restraint in the limits of executive power, having been a strong believer in Roosevelt's progressivism but feeling that Roosevelt's authoritarianism was going too far. Wilson is another instance of a president who assumed additional powers in a time of war, but ideologically Wilson's style of progressivism would probably lay south of Roosevelt but west of Taft. Still willing to use government power and even emergency powers, but also being far more idealistic in what could be achieved with limited executive authority, while also being more sympathetic to matters of workers' rights, women's rights, and children's rights than Taft. Harding would take us far and back from the authoritarian left quadrant, moving us deeper into the libertarian right quadrant, being an extremely laissez-faire and pro-business politician with his even more hands-off successor Calvin Coolidge moving us even further into the southeast. Ideologically, Hoover would try to steer the country back toward progressivism, seeking to strike a balance between business, government, and labor. Hoover would probably stand somewhere to the northeast of Taft, making him about as authoritarian as Lincoln or Roosevelt. FDR would surpass Theodore Roosevelt in his use of government power and adopted even greater powers during wartime. His New Deal economic policy would make him the furthest left president on the chart yet. Ideologically, Truman was less of an economic reformer and more of a social reformer. Not crossing into the libertarian left quadrant yet, Truman's politics are significantly to the south and east of FDR. Eisenhower's social conservatism and New Deal sympathies would place him in between and to the east of FDR and Truman, but still within the authoritarian left quadrant. Ironic. Eisenhower wasn't above using extended government power both domestically and abroad, and despite his anti-communist reputation, was sympathetic to many New Deal social programs. Ideologically, JFK is our first president in the libertarian left quadrant, being ever so slightly more sympathetic to freer business practices and social reform than even Truman, placing him to Truman's southeast. Johnson, being an ideological New Deal stalwart, would raise authority back up, pushing further to the left and nearing the level of authority FDR held, holding strong positions on major economic reform, extensive social programs, and civil rights. Nixon was a strong proponent for dialing back government authority and found himself more aligned with small government Republicans under the concept of new federalism, which in reality had more in common with Jeffersonian decentralization. His personal ideology was fairly nuanced and pragmatic, placing him just south of John Quincy Adams. Ford was another ideologically indifferent president, though he did align with Nixon's vision to a degree. He probably lay somewhere to the southwest of Nixon. Ideologically, Carter is perhaps the most libertarian left president in US history, and would probably rank well to the south of Truman. Reagan, as an early neoconservative, could be expected to rank fairly close to the center in the libertarian right quadrant. George H.W. Bush would largely share Reagan's ideas, but was notably more elitist and willing to use government power both in foreign and domestic affairs. Clinton famously developed his third-way political philosophy, which was essentially neoliberalism, and attempted to balance center-left and center-right ideals within a liberal framework. This would probably place him to the northeast of Carter. George W. Bush could be expected to stand somewhere between Reagan and his father, being a bit more idealistic and politically apathetic. He had what he called compassionate conservatism, which, kind of like Clinton, attempted to strike a balance between the liberal right and left. Obama demonstrated a far greater willingness to use government power than his immediate predecessors, but still doesn't break out of the liberal left quadrant, landing just left of JFK and just south of Truman. Trump's America First ideology draws from several right-wing American schools of thought and naturally lands fairly in the middle of the authoritarian right quadrant and reaches fairly far to the east. Biden's ideology is heavily influenced by New Deal-era politics with a strong desire to use government power to achieve ends of economic and social reform. This places him on the same authority level as Trump but far to the west, resting just below Lyndon Johnson. I'd say this all came together pretty well, especially considering how well these points can fit into sensible ideological clusters. Let me know what you think in the comments below and if any of these should be changed. Like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.